Well, first of all, a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today here at the VCDNP office, but also those who are watching us online. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And today is a very special occasion. We gathered, and I'm extremely delighted we have an opportunity today to host the launch of the European launch of Mariana Budjeryn's book, Inheriting the Bomb. As we are grappling with the consequences and implications of the war in Ukraine that started more than a year ago, Russian aggression, the issue of the inheritance by Ukraine of nuclear weapons and the implications for what is taking place now and what could be the lessons from both the Ukrainian experience and legacy in this nuclear sphere, and the implications for the world now about nuclear weapons and their role cannot be overestimated. It's an extremely important issue. But it's also extremely important to understand why and how Ukraine approached its inheritance, and what were the drivers, what kind of discussions were behind that decision. And I'm really, really delighted that we have that opportunity today to discuss it. Mariana, you are a fabulous writer and speaker. You know, I really congratulate you on first writing this book. And I don't know, it's on the cover there, it's on the cover of the book. It's beautiful, not only from outside, but very much inside. It's a wonderful, beautiful story, well researched and written. I understand you probably spent countless hours in the archives and doing interviews. First of all, big congratulations to you. This is a really, really big achievement. But it's also extremely timely, and I'm really happy that we have that opportunity to hear from the author of the book today. And for those who don't know, Mariana is a senior research associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center. And she also worked with them as a Stanton Fellow and also as a fellow at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, visiting professor at Tufts University and Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. So you've been with very top research and think tanks organization for a number of years, but her training is, she holds a PhD in political science and a master's in international relations from the Central European University, which used to be in Budapest, but actually now located in Vienna, for those of you who don't know.
Quellenstrasse.
Yeah, exactly. And she has a bachelor's in political science from the Kiev Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. So Mariana is also a wonderful friend and colleague. I had a privilege of listening to your presentations and engagement at many different fora and discussions. Your insights are always extremely valuable, and I'm both delighted that we have that book now available to everyone, but also to hear from you about both the book and your journey through writing the book. Warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very, very kind introduction. And yeah, you mentioned that it took me long hours. It took me long years, actually, too. So it's a long overdue project. And I wish, it is timely, but in a very unfortunate way. I wish it had come out under a different set of circumstances. But as it comes out now, the second part of this subtitle is easy to answer why it matters, right? Ukraine is a site of a major conventional war today, one that is waged with extensive use of nuclear threats. It has very prominent nuclear undertones in terms of nuclear security, security of nuclear civilian nuclear facilities. We all know about the occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We know about the threats that the aggressor has been kind of brandishing and using, the nuclear status of the Russian Federation. And so, a lot of questions arise as to exactly what had happened back in, some 25, 30 years ago when Ukraine came into this nuclear inheritance. But before I launch into a bit of the presentation about the book, mostly about some of the takeaways that are most relevant for today, or I think most relevant for today, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you, and especially Elena, for the support and for this kind of really generous help that you've extended, and I'm sure many of you in deed and in thought, for supporting the Ukrainian plight at this hour of need, doing very important work that kind of tries to get us closer to a world that's more equitable, more just, and more secure. And as I hope it will come apparent from this presentation, this is a lot more than just about Ukraine, right? It's about Ukraine, it's about Russia, but it's also about the consequences for how we think about the value of nuclear arms and armaments in the world. What is their purchase? What do they do? What can they not do? So without further ado, this is why this is more relevant than under a different set of circumstances. There's a war of aggression in Europe, the most intense kind of fighting since World War II. If we look at the expenditure of munitions, we look at casualties, people displaced, and so forth. I mean, this city here has hosted many Ukrainian refugees, and has done a lot to help out. And when we look at the scale of conventional violence, right, we think, well, what could have prevented it? Were there any other options? And when these questions are asked, Ukraine's nuclear history certainly enters a conversation in one shape or form, not just since February 2022, but actually since 2014, since the first round of kind of aggression, the annexation of Crimea, the war in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's nuclear history has become more of a prominent topic of conversation. And in the public domain and public discourse, it has, I detect at least two narratives that have emerged. One in Ukraine is largely that of regret, right? The story goes, Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal and gave it away for nothing but empty promises, i.e., the so-called Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances to Ukraine in connection with its accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So that's one story. The other story, largely the one one detects in the West, is that of how marginal the topic has been over the past 30 years. That much has been forgotten, even in official circles, even amongst the people who study nuclear matters and who engage with this topic, and amongst the experts, there's kind of another end of the spectrum of the narrative that goes, well, those were not Ukrainian weapons. Those were Russian weapons or Soviet weapons. Ukraine did not have command control over these weapons. So essentially, those were not Ukrainian weapons to give up. And so any sort of claims to recognition, or even, certainly much less so any kind of narratives of regret, are misplaced. Ukraine had no choice, had no options. Those were not Ukrainian weapons to give up. And as someone who spent, I'm embarrassed to say, a good part of a decade researching this book in Ukraine, but also in the archives in Minsk, Belarus, in Almaty in Kazakhstan, in Moscow, and in lots of places in the United States, I can tell you that the truth, in as much as we have access to it, is a lot more complicated. It's somewhere in the middle. It is, a lot more nuanced. And this is what the bulk of the book is about. And it's trying to present the story from the inside. It's not sort of a comprehensive history of the post-Soviet nuclear disarmament. There are certainly kind of many more elements from the United States. That some of them have been written up in memoirs and such. My task here was to show how things looked from Kiev at that time, from somewhere from 1990 to 1994, when Ukraine joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state. So what happened in 1991 often escapes kind of its true significance, because the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia as an inheritor as a fully fledged inheritor of the Soviet nuclear status under the NPT, of its seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and so forth, it happened so quickly, and it went largely uncontested. But in the nuclear domain, what manifested itself in these first post-Soviet years was actually a contestation about this succession. There was a process to take place, not just in Ukraine, but also in Kazakhstan. Belarus did not sort of put up the fight, did not stake much of a claim, but in the early days in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan, there was a contestation about the issue of legal succession to the Soviet Union. Because, of course, Soviet Union was not reducible to Russia alone. Of course, Russia was the biggest part, the kind of most endowed in terms of, it had, all the links of a nuclear weapons program. But in international legal terms, a case could be made that, there was one state and it fractured into bits. And who gets to inherit the assets, right, and the property of that state? In conventional realm, there wasn't much kind of international contestation about that. So whatever the armaments were left in the territory of the post-Soviet republics was properly considered the property and of that inheritor state. But not so in the nuclear realm, and for very good reasons. But this here you see, in particular, the strategic nuclear forces of the former Soviet Union, those declared under the Strategic Arms Reductions and Limitations Treaty, known as START 1, signed in 1991. So it's an enormous nuclear complex kind of spread across this very large Eurasian landmass. And overnight, it found itself on a territory of not one, but 4 separate sovereign states. And what ensued was kind of the deliberations of what to do in this very unprecedented situation. These are some of the major nuclear-related or strategic and nuclear installations in Ukraine. Ukraine inherited exactly 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, deployed in 2 locations and 2 divisions, one in Pervomaisk and one in Khmelnytsky, closer to western Ukraine. Strategic aviation, 44 strategic bombers, Tu-95 Bears and Tu-160s, Blackjacks. Incidentally, those are exactly the bombers the Russian Federation uses today to launch missiles against Ukraine. They are deployed on the base in Engels, which you might have heard got also attacked by a Ukrainian drone a few months back. Ukraine also inherited a very robust civilian nuclear infrastructure. 5 nuclear power plants, 1 Chernobyl was eventually closed, but that takes a certain sort of know-how, it takes certain kinds of science, it takes know-how about how to deal with spent nuclear fuel and so forth. So, in addition to just the military, the actual weapons, there was a lot more that Ukraine inherited in terms of the military-industrial complex that could deliver these weapons. Most notably, one of the 3 major ICBM producers in what is now Dnipro, used to be Dnipropetrovsk, was mostly known by its Russian name, Yuzhny Design Bureau in Yuzhmash, that produced some of the most modern at that time ICBMs in the Soviet arsenal, and the MIRV, the ones that have multiple warheads on them. So at the time of Soviet dissolution, about 70% of strategic missile warheads were deployed on Ukrainian-made missiles, right? So kind of the bulk of Soviet deterrent, which was very much missile-based, was deployed on missiles produced at Yuzhmash. What Ukraine did lack was the fuel cycle, and that was a major part, of a nuclear program, and of course the warhead production facilities. But it did have a lot of good scientists and a lot of scientists with clearances in the Soviet nuclear project. I recently met, after the book was already submitted, I recently met a gentleman who was the head of the archival department at the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. And those of you who know, that's the ministry that oversaw the Soviet nuclear program. And that gentleman was a Ukrainian. And he transferred to Ukraine in '92. His daughter now works in Washington, Ukrainian service of Voice of America. And for 2 more years, his pass to the ministry still worked. Because as Elena, you remember, that was kind of a messy time, right? Then people weren't checking things. So he could still travel back to Moscow and go into the heart of, the Soviet nuclear program as a Ukrainian with his old pass. And there was a lot of things like that going on. So by 1994, Ukraine relinquishes all of that. In 2 more years, by 1996, the last nuclear warhead leaves Ukraine's territory, and with US technical assistance, Ukraine proceeds to, dismantle missiles, blow up silos in which they were deployed, cut up a bunch of aircraft. Some of the strategic aircraft were sold back to Russia. Another, number were literally cut up, brand new aircraft, never flown. The Tu-160s, that was the first deployed regiment in the Soviet Union. Russia had a few test aircraft at that time at Engels. In Ukraine, it was the first regiment in Perluki of 25 Tu-160s. They were literally never flown, and they were cut up. And I've talked to, the airmen who watched that, and they said the grown men were, crying. So that beautiful machine, right? We all know it's a death machine. It delivers weapons. It's no good. But all of that was destroyed. What went into this decision making? There were a bunch of things on both sides of the ledger. There were things that were weighing towards kind of a nuclear option for Ukraine. And when we talk about nuclear option, we all always tend to think in these binary terms. Could have Ukraine kept and used, these weapons? I mean, it would have had to do a lot more work, right, to turn its inheritance into a fully fledged deterrent. And it didn't have to be done overnight. What some forces in Ukraine tried to do was to delay the process, to kind of deliberate the options and see what you can do. I mean, when we think about Pakistan, when we think about India, none of the armaments happened overnight, right? It was a decades-long process. And so what some of the political forces in Ukraine tried to do was to kind of push the decision back in order to buy some time to deliberate. But as it happens, you know, the factors that weigh towards at least considering a nuclear option or some kind of hedging or some kind of latency were the security concerns. Of course, it turned out that the relations between the new Russia and new Ukraine became tense almost immediately. Much of it was over the status of Crimea and Sevastopol, where Russian Black Sea Fleet was based, the division of the Black Sea Fleet itself, Ukraine's dependency on gas and oil from Russia, and generally sort of this kind of negotiating the post-Soviet settlement and the role these two states would play in the post-Soviet settlement, which Ukraine wanted to ensure would be much more on the equal basis. And then it had some doubts whether that could actually be possible from the Russian side. There were also status concerns, right? So emerging from this kind of Soviet state in which Russia and Soviet Union were always conflated from the outside. So even some of the best and brightest analysts, even to this day, use these terms interchangeably, and by which making kind of the periphery of the Soviet Union invisible, right? So it was like in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart, and suddenly, out of nowhere, the earth opened, and out came the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the Georgians and Ukrainians. Where did they come from? Weren't they all Russians? And so these kind of blinders made it difficult for the West to kind of regard these new people as nations in their own right, with their own history and their own culture. So for Ukrainians, it was very important to kind of stake this claim and say, we are a very, an ancient and historical nation. We're distinct, and we want to be recognized as an equal successor state to the Soviet Union, at least in these formal, legal terms. Ukrainians also very quickly realized that nuclear issue was very, very, very important to Western policymakers. And if you wanted to keep that attention on Kyiv, that, nuclear things really mattered. I mean, these really invisible places that got no Western attention before suddenly became destinations for these high-level delegations from Washington and from, London and from Brussels. And all of them were asking about nuclear things. Like before they asked, how are you going to survive economically after the Soviet Union collapse? How are you going to reform your institutions? How are you going to do all these other things that seem so much more pressing to people on the ground? And so, in some kind of really ironic, inadvertent way, this singular attention to nuclear proliferation, nuclear proliferation concerns in the West, served to elevate the value of this inheritance in the eyes of, certainly Ukraine, but also Kazakhstan initially, too. And of course, Ukrainians had their own lobby, their own interest groups. They had 30 people in strategic missile force, 30,000 people, strategic missile forces. They would be out of a job. They had strategic aviation regiments. Those people would be out of a job. Yuzhmash, or Pivdenmash in Ukrainian name, at one time, at its height, employed 60,000 people. It was one of those giant Soviet conglomerates. Those people would be out of a job. Well, as they are now, I mean, they're barely surviving on some technology projects and participating in some space projects with the US and Europe, but really, they've disappeared as that kind of entity. So they did lobby for the retention of some kind of missile force, even if not nuclear, then perhaps conventional. But there were many salient factors that weighed in favor of disarmament. And one thing that is often forgotten, that Ukraine has started its path towards independent statehood, back in the late 80s and early 90s, with the passage in 1990, in July 1990, of the State Declaration of Sovereignty, there was this parade of sovereignty. Actually, Russia adopted a declaration of sovereignty first in June, and Ukraine a month later, in July of 1990, declaring that the laws of these republics were supreme to the laws of the Union. And in that declaration, it declared, without any pressure from the Russians or the Americans, unilaterally declared its desire to become, in the future, a nuclear-free state. Why? Chernobyl was a major reason. There was, an immense social trauma that kind of seeped through the entire society. Of the kind of imprint that the Chernobyl catastrophe left in Ukraine. And in addition, all things nuclear were sort of associated with these negligent and kind of repressive policies of the center, the Soviet center, the center in Moscow. So people who were the authors of this declaration of sovereignty, they understood that if Ukraine were to become an independent state, it had to sever these military ties, these very hyper-centralized and very secretive military connections that kept basically Ukraine tethered to the center. And they understood that as long as these weapons are deployed in Ukraine, Moscow will never let go. Well, as it happened, history had its own plan, and the Soviet Union collapsed without the need before these weapons were removed. The Soviet Union basically crumbled, and then Ukraine's position became more nuanced. But some element of that remained, right? The command and control was still centralized. It would have taken an effort. It was not impossible. Ukraine could have established operational control. With some effort, of course, with the scientists and engineers that had been part of the Soviet nuclear program. But, certainly the Russians would have known right away and could have made efforts to prevent it. But, that was still kind of a centralized system that remained. And throughout the deliberations, there remained a part of Ukrainian special military establishment that saw these kind of strategic forces as a hindrance to the establishment of Ukraine's independent army, because there was still continued influence from Moscow through these strategic forces. Economic woes, right? That's the transitional crisis was really severe. Anyone who has been to the former Soviet Union in the early 90s will know what we're talking about. It was a pretty dire time. So to make an argument that one would invest in, completing the fuel cycle, for instance, or building up, enrichment facilities, conversion facilities, or, warhead production facilities at a time like this would have been a very, very difficult point to make. And of course, the two major nuclear powers, Russia and the US, had a vested interest in non-proliferation and removing weapons from these countries. But my argument in the book is also that the NPT, the International Non-Proliferation Regime, played an extremely, extremely important role in framing and guiding the deliberations about disarmament in the former Soviet Union, simply, again, because the existence of this regime set the rules and terms for legitimized nuclear possession. So if in the conventional realm, Ukraine could claim that, so many tanks and so many aircraft and so many artillery pieces are legitimately Ukraine's property. In the nuclear realm, that argument was not sustainable for this simple reason that NPT existed, and it defined what constitutes a recognized nuclear power. And anyone who wants to maintain a nuclear deterrent has to be outside of the regime, right? Those were the kinds of choices that Ukrainians were faced with. And so my takeaway number one from the story of Ukraine's disarmament is that Ukraine did have agency and it did have choices, right? The fact that Ukraine made ultimately the right choice does not mean it didn't have a choice to make, a less prudent decision. And so there is a recognition that's due to Ukraine and to Kazakhstan for making the right choice. We know that states make plenty of bad decisions, right? And they end up paying the price. And some of them pay a dear price for it, and others weather the storm and move on. Again, Ukraine is often, or the potential, the counterfactual is, would Ukraine and Kazakhstan have been the North Koreas of Central Asia or the North Korea of Eastern Europe? Possibly. Maybe they could have been the Pakistan or India of Central Asia or Eastern Europe. We don't know how that would have developed, right? But one thing that Ukraine did have is that claim towards legitimate legal succession to the Soviet Union. And that without the NPT in existence, that would have been a really powerful claim. The takeaway number 2 is that, again, related to emphasize my point, it was not a free-for-all. Ukraine did not enter some, anarchical mayhem of a world. World had order, and the nuclear order was a major part of the international order at the time, and it just so happened that 2 major stakeholders and their allies had an interest in enforcing that order, right? Had a vested interest in enforcing that order. What I talked about, the non-proliferation regime providing terms for legitimate nuclear possession, but also the arms control architecture that was in place. One of the unsung heroes of this story is the INF Treaty. Not only Ukraine, but also possibly Kazakhstan, that much I don't know, but I'm pretty sure. Ukraine had a ton of INF assets, intermediate and medium-range missiles, before they were destroyed under the treaty. Now, those were mobile systems. There were shorter-range systems that would have been, quote-unquote, a lot more usable if Ukraine have decided to use them as a deterrent against Russia, a deterrent against the West, which ICBMs were certainly more, lended themselves more aptly to that task. And so the fact that the last INF missile was destroyed in June 1991 at Kapustin Yar, the range in southern Russia, that was a really lucky set of circumstances for the world, because I think a story of Ukraine's disarmament would have been a lot different had these medium-range, intermediate-range missiles have still been in Ukraine's territory. Moreover, when Ukraine considered a missile force, right, a strategic missile force with conventional warheads, sort of a precursor to Prom Global Strike, as it were, right? That was something that Ukrainian missile industry was sort of pushing for, sort of interested in considering. They quickly discovered that the ranges that would have been useful to Ukraine for deterrence of Russia, for instance, were exactly the ranges that were prohibited by the INF Treaty, from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. And so with ICBM force in place that, flew to what? 10,000 kilometers, 15,000 kilometers, what are you going to hold at risk? Vladivostok? That's not credible, right? So all of these things were in place, and all of these things came to play their role. And finally, my last takeaway is the one that pertains to the famous or infamous, depending whom you ask, Budapest Memorandum. It was a political document, certainly not legally binding, but signed by the heads of state of Ukraine and the 3 NPT depository states, the Russian Federation, the United States, and the United Kingdom, that pledged assurances, security assurances to Ukraine. What those essentially were, they were copy-pasted from other multilateral instruments, such as the UN Charter, which is legally binding, last time I checked, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act of the, at that time, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, now OSCE, and the negative and positive NPT-related nuclear security assurances. In 2014, clearly, this document was violated by one of the signatories. And the assurances included recognition of Ukraine's borders. They pledged not to use force against Ukraine's territorial integrity and its borders, and that was clearly violated. At which point Ukrainians woke up to the fact that, hey, we have this Budapest Memorandum, and now it's violated, and nothing really is happening. Well, my argument is that these kinds of agreements are what you make of them. Ukrainians, unfortunately, failed to leverage this document before it got violated. So it was basically out there somewhere on the shelf. In Ukrainian, by the way, as well as in Russian, it's translated as security guarantees. And there's this backstory about that I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. So they said, wait a minute, we have security guarantees. How come is this not, not being observed? I'm probably running out of time. I'm good. All right. And what they could have done better was to use this document signed in 1994 as a framework for building security and defense cooperation with these states, right? Working at it, working, in Washington and in London and, perhaps in Moscow too, to kind of bolster Ukraine's security through in real means, instead of resting on laurels by saying, hey, we got this piece of paper signed, we're good. Now, what the West could have done much better, or the other signatories, the United States in particular, was to leverage this document post-2014. If you kind of just browse through and take a quick look through kind of the appearance of the Budapest Memorandum and any of the kind of Western mentions, it's very sparse. There was one meeting of the signatories that was convened on March 5th, 2014, as the Russians were preparing to hold a referendum in Crimea about annexation. Of course, it upheld Ukraine's territorial integrity. Of course, it said, yes, this is terrible. And then it was it. Neither the United States nor the United Kingdom entered in negotiations on the settlement and on ceasefire. It was left to Germany and France, the so-called Normandy format, and produced the Minsk agreements, which were not implementable from Ukrainian standpoint, and which then served as a pretext for, or the lack of implementations of which served as a pretext for a full-fledged invasion 8 years later. So, signing a document is good. Making something out of it is what the international politics really calls for. Consequences. It is hard to see how this is a good story for non-proliferation. With all the nuance notwithstanding, with all the impediments that Ukraine would have had in turning this nuclear inheritance into a fully fledged deterrent, to something that could have worked for its security, the pure optics of the situation are simply awful. There was a country, it had at least an option, it had a claim to this inheritance. It gave it up only in exchange for security assurances, for security commitments from nuclear states. And some 20-some years later, 30 years later, one of the signatories of these assurances turns around, invades the country, hundreds of thousands dead on both sides, millions displaced. What could have prevented that? I mean, it's not enough to say that, Ukrainians might prevail eventually, even without nuclear weapons. That would be a good story, right? But that's little comfort to those who lost their lives, to the relatives who lost their lives in this very unnecessary war, to the millions who have been displaced, to a generation of children that are growing up in bomb shelters, to thousands of women raped. Like, you cannot undo that. And the question becomes, what could have prevented that in the first place? And the job of this community, and I'm sure we're largely on the same page here, the job of this community of convincing a country that's in a similar security predicament, a country that's not an ally of a nuclear armed state, that's not covered by extended deterrence of a nuclear state, that might have kind of a more powerful, wealthier neighbor, more capable militarily, and a threatening neighbor. Our job of persuading them that the answer is not nuclear weapons has just gotten a lot harder. It's not impossible, it's just a lot harder. The converse of the side of this coin is that deterrence is proving its worth for those who benefit from it. The conflict a year on is contained on the territory of Ukraine, of the original theater. Nobody has joined the fray. You know, there's great support Ukraine is receiving from its Western partners, but the actual fighting and dying remains in Ukraine. The original two belligerents are the ones who are still, you know, in the fight. Nobody has joined in. It's a markedly different situation than August 1990 when Kuwait got invaded by Saddam Hussein. And, you know, Ukraine has not invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter for collective defense, which it could have. Doesn't need UN Security Council authorization for that. Why? Because Ukraine knows full well nobody would come in. Why? Because of fear of nuclear escalation, a very justifiable fear of nuclear escalation. I think the West is doing very much the right thing, right? We don't want a conventional war between NATO and Russia, between two nuclear-armed parties. And so, you know, these questions are really uncomfortable, and this reality is really uncomfortable for those, again, who try to reduce the salience or try to reduce the reliance on nuclear weapons and on nuclear deterrence, because it's kind of proving its worth in doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to contain escalation and to prevent conventional conflict between two nuclear-armed parties. And on that somewhat disappointing and sad note, I will end, and I very much welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mariana. Boy, yeah, the last part particularly is difficult to absorb and live with, so to speak. Indeed, there are implications, and we will feel it for quite some time. But thank you also for that tour de force through the history and the decision-making and all these different factors that went into thinking. The way we're going to handle Q&As is those of you who are in the room, you just raise your hand, please state your name, and then I'll keep a track who are giving floor to. Those who watch us online, please, either if you're on Zoom, please use Q&A function to post your questions. And those on YouTube or whatever else we're watching, you can send it to events@vcdnp.org. So with that, I have already a list of my own questions, but I will hold on to them, and we'll start with the questions from the audience. Please.
Please wait for the microphone, because people online.
All right.
Yeah. Yep. Important part. Wait for a microphone.
Chomping at the bit, but I'll hold that. All right. Will I hold it or will you hold it?
Okay. Yeah, I can hold it.
It's all right. I can manage. Thanks.
So the participants
Yes. All right. So if I understand correctly, the Budapest Memorandum did not have any enforcement mechanisms in it or mentioned any sanctions whatsoever. It was just a statement of good intent that, yes, we'll recognize the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and if somebody violates that. So it's like writing a traffic code where you say you shouldn't go through a red light, and if you do, we just go tisk, 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 and nothing. Knowing what we know now, are there any model agreements or suggestions, let's say, should we be in a similar situation what kind of enforcement mechanisms could have been put in place back then, if we'd had a good crystal ball back then?
That's an excellent question. So no, there wasn't an enforcement mechanism. Ukraine had tried to negotiate that in, but was not successful. It was a principal stance of the United States that it did not want to pledge any new commitments, right? So whatever was already out there within the UN system or the OECD system, they would kind of reassure, right, or re-pledge, but no new commitments. Certainly not anything closely akin to Article 5, right? What was floated, the idea that was considered at the time, again by the Ukrainian side, is, incidentally, Austria's State Treaty of 1955. So a legally binding treaty that would have some kind of guaranteed neutrality, right? So neither side could move in, right? That was, again, rejected mostly by the United States, because any treaty would have had to go to Congress for consent to ratification. And if you're a US president and you can get away with something without having to go to Congress, you get that done. You know, Clinton had at the time his own battles. He was actually preparing to pick a battle over CTBT at the time, actually, with Congress, which ultimately unsuccessful, but he kept his...
CTBT, drawing a blank.
Oh, sorry, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So that kind of loomed in the future, and he knew that was going to be a difficult thing to accomplish, and he failed. In the end, the U.S. still has not ratified that treaty. So to pick a battle with Congress over something like Ukraine just didn't seem worth it. Plus, U.S. had so much leverage that it could kind of put the screws in and get Ukraine to sign this Budapest Memorandum as it was. It was not a legally binding document. It did not contain any sanctions for violating it. But it was sort of a gentleman's agreement, a promise to say, we take your security seriously. Now, Ukraine's security is within the realm of US national interest. At least that's what people who were on the US side negotiating the agreement say, and they actually were quite vocal in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, and trying to put, I mean, a lot of them were out of government already, but you know, they signed letters and they tried to argue with the Obama administration to take a more forceful stand towards this violation. And you know, institutional memories are short, especially in the United States where there is a big turnover. So that, I think, was a mistake, and perhaps might have laid the ground for a fully fledged invasion, because it might have been that the rulers in Kremlin concluded that not much happened after 2014. But yet, I think it is a very important document, because it is part and parcel of the broader non-proliferation regime, right? And it's part of that history. It's part of this institutional makeup. And that's why the breach of it has such kind of these reverberations across the entire system.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see other hands. There are some questions on coming from the audience.
I can ask another one if you have a pause.
Why don't we take some questions from online, and I'll give the microphone to Noah Mayhew to read out.
Thank you, Elena and Mariana. You have lots of questions coming in from online, but this is actually a sort of good that this was already queued up, because about half of them have to do with the Budapest Memorandum. So I'll group a couple of them. Thomas Lafitte asks, regarding the 2014 sequence, could we state, in principle, that the US and UK would have been more comfortable engaging in mediation in 2014 had there not been the Budapest Memorandum? In other words, was it because they really did not want to face their responsibility from that memorandum that they were interested in what he's referred to as outsourcing the mediating job to France and Germany? On that note, Ihor Anochen says, greetings from Kyiv. How would you comment, he asks, on US President Bill Clinton's statement in a recent interview where he expressed regret for his role in convincing Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons in 1994. I have not read the article, but I'll be interested to hear what you say about it. And also on this note, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Hiroaki Nakanishi asks, what elements might there be required to have a new Budapest Memorandum? Would such a thing be possible? The question is much longer, so sorry I had to condense your questions, but all of them related to the Budapest Memorandum.
All right. Okay. Budapest Memorandum.
Easy question.
Oh, absolutely. So I don't think the existence of the Budapest Memorandum particularly prevented UK or US in engaging more actively with mediation or negotiating ceasefire. From what I understand, it was really it was President Obama personally and his national security advisor, Susan Rice, that made that decision. There was kind of pressures within the administration, within the kind of the cabinet more broadly, the executive more broadly, to take a stronger stance on the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, to extend sort of greater defense and military assistance at the time. But it was the sort of the personal stance and personal decision of President Obama not to do so, not even to release the anti-tank weapons, the javelins, sort of lethal defensive weapons at the time to Ukraine that were authorized by Congress that couldn't agree on anything else. That was so toxic, but they agreed on one thing, that provide these weapons to Ukraine, and that administration still held those back. Those were not released to Ukraine until 2017 under the Trump administration. Probably despite of President Trump and because of him, but as it happens, these are the facts. I think it was simply the failure to understand just how grave the dangers are, and that this might be the beginning, not just kind of a one-off, that this is or maybe not, again, fears of escalation, not wanting to fuel the conflict, especially if you're a recipient of Nobel Peace Prize. It's a very difficult decision to do it at that point. But there was certainly nothing that prevented the United States and the United Kingdom for stepping in at that point. And I think that was a strategic mistake. Clinton's regret. Yeah, I was actually really surprised to read that. I think the word regret did not figure in his actual speech. He said he feels personally responsible. And I think what he might have meant, not that, he should have pressured or he should have taken a more relaxed stance towards Ukraine retaining nuclear weapons, but perhaps being more in tuned or attuned to Ukraine's demands. Again, not doing it the easy way. And one of the things in my conclusion is that history has a way of striking back. If the deals come easy, and if they come at a low cost for the powerful, then they could be broken by the powerful in a really easy way. And then we all deal with consequences, right? In addition to just war, there's just peace. And if a peace is not just, it will not hold. And so, this agreement is the kind of the example of it. It came easy to the United States. It could have just said, guys, we're not going to release any IMF or World Bank structural funds. I know you have 10,000% inflation a year. You're trying to introduce a new currency, balance it and stabilize it, but we're just not going to go there until you join the NPT. And to join the NPT, Ukrainians had to show something internally to the actors that, that wanted a deal, wanted a fair deal, right? And so they said, all right, let's sign this document. You guys can call it guarantees. We stick by assurances because for the US, guarantees is a kind of more powerful concept that involves a military commitment. And they could do that, right? But again, it turned out to be a more complicated story. So perhaps coming back to Clinton, the way I choose to kind of interpret it, and of course we can ask Bill Clinton himself exactly what he meant, but I think perhaps the regret is about not taking Ukraine's security consideration more seriously at the time. Again, not to say, we'll help you build a deterrent or whatever, but perhaps kind of overlooking that severity. A new Budapest memorandum, of course, Ukrainians are now it's a very toxic word for Ukrainians, and they would need to see something a lot more robust than that to agree to. But I think the strategic problem remains. Whatever is going to be the end of this war, and that will end and result in some kind of diplomatic settlement, even if Ukraine agrees to be left with less, maybe not officially recognized, but with less territory than it started off in 1991. The question remains, how do you secure that rump Ukraine? What is it that you do as international community, as Western, strategic partners and allies? What can you pledge to the rest of Ukraine in order to prevent this from happening again? Is it going to be NATO membership? Is it going to be a coalition of the willing? Some kind of tripartite US, UK, Poland. I think there was kind of that idea floated for a while right before the invasion. And what is it that you are going to pledge? And that, for a country like Ukraine, that remains a really difficult question to answer, partly because there's sort of a reason why it was so difficult to absorb Ukraine into NATO, even in the better days, right? It's a giant security vacuum. In a sense, it's not surprising that a major war broke out there. Doesn't have allies, doesn't have extended deterrence. What are the barriers other than the strength of Ukrainian army to prevent, to deter an invasion? And there was kind of an underestimation of the cost that would be involved. So I don't have a good answer to that question. What I'm supposing is that the new Budapest memorandum better be a lot different than the old.
Thank you, Mariana. Okay, we'll go back to the room. There I see two hands, and we'll come to you afterwards.
Okay.
So please wait until the microphone, and please introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is David Menham. I'm a British subject, but I've been living here for 22 years. I'm married to a Hungarian. Yeah, sorry. It's not a question, but an observation. You can hear me, yeah? We arrived here in the 1990s, and during that time, my wife was working for the American Embassy at the time. There was a lot of talk about common security in Europe, and Russia was heavily involved in that at the time. That's all disappeared. Could we not re-establish something along those lines, for security for the whole of Europe, to get round these difficult problems that we have at the moment, which you've described so well, really, for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'll collect more questions so that you can, please, over there, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. Dagmar Vodlicek, University of Vienna. Thank you for fascinating presentation, and congratulations to the book. I was wondering, you talk about what Ukraine eventually did not end up inheriting, that is the nuclear weapons, but you talk also about the large military industrial complex that Ukraine did inherit, and the legacies of all sorts of Soviet military programs. And I was wondering if you could briefly talk about that and how those played a role in the post-Cold War development. Because I recall that many of these in Eastern Europe, and in Eastern European countries, which eventually ended up being NATO members, these were transformed to a large extent into NATO facilities and all sorts of really facilities, but also expertise, knowledge, materials, and so forth, were transformed into like pro-NATO military infrastructures. So I was wondering how this played a role in the Ukraine development. Thank you.
So about the comment... one more, sorry.
Question.
All right, I didn't introduce myself previously, so I'll do it now. My name is Jeff Manners. I'm a retired insurance executive who's worked professionally in Central and Eastern Europe for over 40 years and a lifelong student of the history and economics and sociology of Central and Eastern Europe. My question is provoked by your answer to my previous question, the political environment that influenced Clinton going for the easy solution, not wanting to go to Congress, to knowing what was going on at the time this memorandum was being put together was the Yugoslav and Bosnian War. And there was a lot of controversy about how the U.S. should be involved, or at that point, not until '95 and Srebrenica happened, it was basically arms embargo, don't get involved, stay away. In your research and in your study, what was the active influence of the Yugoslav conflict on the decision-making behind the Budapest Memorandum? I am too.
All right, so let's start in the beginning. The common security for Europe, that was certainly an idea and a very noble one. And it seems to me that, you know, in the Russian political arena at the time, there was certainly, you know, a group of people, reformers and around in the Yeltsin's entourage that would have very much liked that to happen and, you know, engaged with the West on those terms and so forth. Again, I'm not an expert in kind of Russian politics at that time, only to the extent that it relates to kind of this topic. But it seemed to me, and something that struck me when I worked in the Russian archives, was just how embattled that group was internally. They were facing the West and they seemed to be representing the West. But the opposition in the parliament was so severe. The discussions in the committees, the Defense and National Security Committee, I mean, there was a lot of old thinking still left. And by October 1993, Yeltsin was firing at his parliament. I mean, there was an attempt to depose him. So kind of that window in which Russia could have transformed into the kind of country that would have, wanted to be kind of accepted into this, or kind of be part of forging this joint European home on the kinds of terms that also resonated with largely the rest of Europe. It was very, very, very narrow, and Elena can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's kind of this romanticizing of the 90s and the extent on which cooperation was possible and things. Then the domestic developments really came to bear in the post-Soviet realm. All of these countries that kind of emanated from the Soviet collapse ended up with really kind of dysfunctional economic and political systems in which money and power was not just money was influencing power as it happens. They were inseparable. That was one system. It was one vertical. It happened in Russia, it happened in Kazakhstan, it happened in Ukraine. The only difference being in Russia, that system became institutionalized. That is the state. In Ukraine, the state was never so powerful. These interests, the oligarchic interests, were battling, and whenever there were cracks, civil society could still come through. You had one revolution, you had two revolutions, and so forth. So people still attempted, at least, to keep that system in check. And the reason why this latest kind of revolution of dignity sprung up was over the signature of association agreement with the EU. Why did the people want that? For no other reason. I mean, there are benefits. Students wanted to be part of the Erasmus program, just like kids from this country. Anyone who had to apply for visas coming from Eastern Europe and Central Asia knows how humiliating that is. Young people didn't want to be humiliated that way. They knew they were no worse than their Polish or Czech counterparts or peers. But there was also a profound understanding that kind of joining Europe in that way would also put the checks and the limitations on the local elites, would force them to accept reforms, to push through, legal reforms, energy sector reforms. The European Union would force these changes, would clean up that system in some way through the process of accession. And that's what they wanted, right? Trying to think how that would happen in the Russian case is really difficult. So when you absorb that kind of very large country and very powerful country, it would be very difficult to say, like, EU, common NATO, all right, you guys need to make sure that, this Putin and his cronies, kind of clean up their act internally. They just don't take those kind of instruction. Were you not?
Comic-Con exists as well. All these countries are not part of the EU. Really,
People on Zoom cannot hear you, sir.
oh, yeah, I've got the
Yeah.
Reminder that microphone is not for the room.
I think probably we will continue that discussion later.
Yeah,
we have
maybe we
only
could continue
10
that.
minutes
Okay,
left, and
fine,
we have
I'll leave it
a few
out.
more questions, so it would be
the
good.
legacy industries and military-industrial complex. That's a good question. I think that's something that where you kind of, as Ukrainians themselves deliberated their politics and their own kind of defense strategy, and there were kind of internal divisions as to which direction the country should be facing, whether Europe or should be closer ties with Russia. And I think in those debates, right, the military-industrial complex was very much neglected. So there wasn't much made of this kind of potential that Ukraine could have leveraged. Now, those industries were hugely inefficient. They had their own sort of problems. It was about kind of the scale and the numbers rather than the quality. So, probably the questions were like, do we really dump more money into something that's might be a black hole? But it is certainly, with a more concerted strategic direction, Ukraine could have done a lot more with its own defense industry, and instead of now going out with open hand and trying to beg for HIMARS and these other systems. I mean, Ukraine is a spacefaring nation. There's 9 or 11 of them in the world. They can launch spacecraft into space. They could have done something for their own defense capacity. Yugoslav War. So Yugoslav War makes an appearance first enunciated by Secretary of State James Baker, who in the fall of 1991 says, we don't want a Yugoslavia with nukes. And that was a very clear direction that was set right there and then by the Bush senior administration, to say there should be no more than one nuclear successor in that Soviet domain. And that remained the kind of the line all the way through the Clinton administration and further. But Ukrainians ended up turning that statement on its head, because again, when they realized just how much interest the nuclear question commands in the West, and all these delegations coming in, they thought, well, if Yugoslavia had nukes, the West would not be just standing back and doing the embargoes and not getting involved. They would come in to do something about that conflict that would not have allowed that to descend into the bloody mess that it did. So they really saw that as a way to keep Western attention on Ukraine, and certainly early on in Kazakhstan too. And they were not wrong, because after the nuclear question was solved, then Ukraine had its own ups and downs. There was like bouts of Ukraine fatigue, and then Ukraine would come online again with a new revolution or whatever. And now there's a war, right? So Yugoslavia was, but not in a single way, right? Just shows how different historical precedents could be interpreted in very different ways.
Thank you, Mariana. I know we have some additional questions from online, and I'll give you a microphone in a second. But I also wanted maybe less of a questions, but adding to what you have discussed, is when you mentioned the role of the arms control, that it had a positive effect. I think it's also extremely important to think about that early 90s is overall the atmospheric of it and the relationship. It's the time, if you think about it, before that we had Reagan-Gorbachev meeting in Reykjavik. where Gorbachev almost says, like, let's get rid of all nuclear weapons. So there was that also general mood and real negotiations, reductions in the nuclear weapons that for many parties we thought that we're moving in the right direction. At least that was the case in the late 80s and early to mid 90s and even later. So many treaties came out of that period, including the negotiations of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that you mentioned, and many others. So I think that is more than just that specific agreements. It's just overall the direction. It's like, well, we're working on it. We'll probably, if not get rid of them, but make them much more salient and relevant.
You're absolutely right. And in the book, I call it the nuclear zeitgeist, right? It was all sort of non-proliferation, arms control reduction, reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the world affairs. The NPT Extension Conference, right? The 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference was incredible, was a really big milestone. And there was, again, that added time pressure to get these countries to join the NPT and the lead up to that. So yeah, there was kind of that mood and the zeitgeist in the air.
One more comment before we go to the question is, when you were speaking about the current situation and that nuclear deterrence seem to be working, at least in terms of the engagement, direct engagement by NATO or Western states in the conflict. But I also think that it demonstrated its limitations as well. If you think about the beginning of at least the 2022 February invasion, there were big concerns about what kind of weapons the United States and Western countries could provide Ukraine. And we've seen that red line that supposedly Russia had is being pushed and moved dramatically. Now we see the tanks coming, the artillery, the planes, because it did show that, that there are limitations. And I think that both the statements that coming from Kremlin, particularly at the beginning of the war, were really intended both to prevent from the engagement, direct engagement in the conflict, but also with the support in terms of military support to Ukraine. So just, you don't have to kind of comment on it. One thing that I wanted to ask for you, I listened carefully when you described the situation, but it was also Belarus that was left with the nuclear weapons on its territory. But your examples mostly, well, now Lukashenko has changed the constitution and we're facing the placement of tactical nuclear weapons in the Belarusian territory. But Belarus, from what I understand, was much an easier case in this respect. But still, I'm sure there are lessons learned from that case. And we'll take one more question, and then we'll call it in terms of no more questions. Noah, what was the question?
So combining two, and again, I'll have to really condense these in the interest of time. So one from Valeria Hessa and one from Muhammad Usama Khalid that I'll combine into one. It's sort of a what could have been and what could be question. So Valeria is asking, is there a plausible scenario in which Ukraine could have kept its nuclear status sort of on hold, on freeze for 10, 20 years, and then later gone back to nuclear weapons development? And Muhammad is asking, considering the debate that's going on now, could this be in the cards in the future for Ukraine? Might the Ukrainian government reconsider its decision to forego nuclear weapons? You spoke about this today and in your book, but I think it's a point that bears repeating. And very, very quickly, someone has also asked where they can buy your book.
On Amazon or on Johns Hopkins University Press website. There's a code that I wish I remember for a 30% discount, and I will.
I should have used it.
I had it on my Twitter for a while, but I'd be happy if you just Google me, find my email address. I'd be happy to provide that to you. About Belarus. That was an easier story back in the day, and most of it took place before Lukashenko became president. And when he did, again, there was some the reservations started appearing almost immediately, but reservations to the extent that Lukashenko looked for very close ties with Russia, so perhaps the weapons could stay as part of, under Russian control, of course, as part of that alliance, which is something he's coming back to now. At that time, though, what we have to remember about Belarus is that it was, it's a small country. It's, 10 million at the time? And proportionally, it was very severely affected by Chernobyl. Even though Chernobyl nuclear power plant was not on Belarusian territory, it was in Ukraine, but because of the weather conditions, a lot of the fallout, a lot of the winds, that blew, Belarus's way. Huge swaths of its territory got polluted. Proportionally, it suffered a lot more than Ukraine, or Russia. There are parts of Russia that got affected too. So that trauma of Chernobyl was even more severe. And also there was a greater continuity between sort of the Soviet and post-Soviet period in terms of the government, the elites, and when in Ukraine the oppositional forces, sort of the so-called National Democratic Forces, took 25% of the seats in the parliament. In Belarus it was 10%. So there was just not enough people, not enough kind of political force to make this a contestation, right? There was very little contestation. But of course it is all the more ironic now that Belarus is so eager to host Russian nuclear weapons on its territory, which is also a lesson in, don't take these anti-nuclear sentiments for granted. Times move on, and political discourses change. To Valeria and Mohammed's question about counterfactuals and what could have been, those are always tricky, especially for a historian to go into this. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that you can't just tweak one variable. You can't say, would Ukraine, things would have been different if only Ukraine had nuclear weapons now. Had Ukraine made a set of decisions to pursue this nuclear option back then, it would have been a different country today. And certainly it would have not probably enjoyed the kind of support in the West that it does today. So if there is a silver lining, is that perhaps we could communicate and impart that it's better to have friends than nuclear weapons. Now, but that's also contingent on the kind of continued Western support and Western political systems are also fickle, right? We're looking at the next presidential elections in the United States, and I'm sure Ukrainians are rather nervous about that. Should the Republicans take presidency, it might not be looking so good. So I suppose, had Ukraine stayed out of the NPT without kind of making any sudden moves on the, building up nuclear fuel cycle or whatever, but just kind of picked its way through. There is a reasoning for building its own nuclear fuel cycle, and 50% of its energy comes from civilian nuclear power. There could have been very kind of certain moves that could be made, and perhaps under certain political circumstances, geopolitical circumstances, the West would have been upset for a little while, like they were with India and Pakistan, and then maybe things would have normalized over time. Again, salami tactics, no sudden moves, no big, announcements. perhaps something like that could have been possible. I don't know. But I think, again, at that time, given the zeitgeist, right, given that kind of general preponderance of a kind of this push towards non-proliferation, towards reductions, towards disarmament, it would have been going against the grain of sort of the entire international consensus on nuclear matters. And I think for a country, for sort of a fledgling sovereign emerging out of this kind of authoritarian, totalitarian, I don't know, empire, it was really important to be a good international citizen. And that joining the NPT was a mark of good international citizenship at that time. And I think it still, in a way, remains today. So that's about the future. I think some of the major reasons that obtained then still obtain today for Ukraine. It's still dependent on Western support. It still wants to be on the good side of, you know, history. It's just that it's paying a very high price for that. Laura?
Just very quick question to Laura, or comment by Laura, and then we'll have to wrap up. I apologize, we already went over a little bit, but I think it's a fantastic.
Senior fellow VCDNP. Apropos Ukraine's interest in being perceived as a good player, I remember back in the mid-90s, they negotiated with the IAEA a comprehensive safeguards agreement before becoming parties to the NPT. And I just looked up the chronology. Their non-NPT comprehensive safeguards agreement was signed in September of '94. They signed another one in 1995, and in between January 1995, before the NPT review conference, they became parties to the NPT. But they had already been negotiating a comprehensive safeguards agreement before becoming parties to the NPT.
Right.
That's fantastic. But I think we've had a fabulous discussion, Mariana. I'm sure many people would like to now read the book because it does, you know, go into such interesting details of that decision making, of that two options presented basically to Ukraine at that time. Thank you for doing this, and keep talking about these issues and the implications for today. It's extremely important to hear that, and my heart goes to you and all the Ukrainians still fighting, but it's still remember, and you know, your last kind of point about being on a good side of history is extremely important, particularly for those who work in our community on nuclear issues. So thank you so much for coming to Vienna and joining us today, and keep talking about these issues.
Thank you so much. Thank you.